would you be interested in coming and serving as the elder for this event? And of course he said, oh yeah, that sounds like a good time. Let's do that. I'll come down a day earlier. I'll get a haircut. It'll all be fine. Well, my dad ditched me. He went to Ottawa on Sunday, and he didn't tell me until Saturday. Oh, yeah, were we going to do that thing? Well, I'm not going to be there. So I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll work it out. Fortunately, I know some wonderful elders in town, and I've always enjoyed working with Tony Cody. And Tony's been certainly a longtime supporter of First Nations University of Canada. He's there to provide supports not only to the students, but also to the staff and to the community. Tony has accepted my invitation today to come and open us up with a prayer. So, Tony, if you wouldn't mind coming to join me here. I want to thank Tony for helping us begin this day together. This is an important conversation. And certainly some of the history behind this event is that a number of things have happened this past year. If you recall last winter, there were a series of things that happened as a result of the disclosure on the federal government's part of the omnibus bills. And as we began to understand the implications for that very lengthy document, many of us had questions about how could this possibly be that they could move these legislative changes forward so quickly without consulting us. And there was resistance. And it was time for question posing and discussion. And here in Regina, many Indigenous people here started to find avenues to have conversations, and we took some of our cues from the Idle No More movement. And we began to have things like the flash mob round dances. We started to have teach-ins, and a number of events were planned here in Regina to help create space for discussion and conversation. And as all of those images ran across our TV screens, I know many of my colleagues wondered, and many of my neighbors too, wondered, what is it that Indian people want, right? What is this all about? Why are they acting like this? And what are these issues? So in response to the question, what do the Indians want? We wanted to mark this day of action for the events that happened here in Regina through the Idle No More Regina group, and some of the things and some of the places that we've been able to create space for discussion in the past. But this event is also about something else that's larger here at the University of Regina. I'm the executive lead for indigenization here at the University of Regina. And about 2 years ago, our university president, President Timmons, wanted to spend some time with Indigenous staff here and with some of the students. And she asked the questions, what do you think's needed here? And they said, we need some space to get together and have conversations about things that are important for us. We need some space to plan with one another because we feel like we're isolated from one another. We're individuals in this unit or that unit, and we are management, and we are faculty, and we're students, and where's that place for us to come together more formally? So the Aboriginal Advisory Circle at the University of Regina was created, and its representatives include faculty and staff as well as students. For the first year or so, there was a great discussion that happened about what does indigenizing the university actually mean? And so there was a lot of conversation and discussion about what that meant. And once they came to this decision, they defined indigenizing the academy here as actually a transformation of the academy, a way of disrupting those inherited messages that we've all received about Canada's past, and a way of recentering Indigenous ways of knowing, our histories, our creative endeavors, and our possibilities. So a big conversation for many of the people that were here at the time. The Aboriginal Advisory Circle undertook strategic planning a year ago, and out of that work came strong voice, strong plan. And it identified 4 key priority areas for our collective work. One was a communication strategy so that we would have a shared understanding of what indigenizing the academy was all about. 2 was a community engagement strategy so that we could hear from more voices in the Indigenous community about how the U of R can better serve our students and our staff. 3 was the academic indigenization piece. What do we need to change in how we currently offer our academic programming? What courses do we need to create? What kinds of teaching methodologies could we be adopting that will allow for greater involvement of Indigenous peoples here? And lastly, the Aboriginal Advisory Circle wanted to increase the visibility and the availability of UR Indigenous events and activities. You see, we really wanted to be able to tell the story of our histories, our contemporary issues, and our aspirations. And we wanted people to learn along with us in those conversations. And so for me, when Jay came to see me, Jay Bird is the co-organizer here. Jay's given a wave. Jay and I met with Ken Montgomery, who was then with the Justice Institute. And the 3 of us sat down and we said, how are we going to mark Idle No More's anniversary in Regina? And very quickly, Red Talk became the response. We wanted to create a space where we could come together and have a critical conversation about what those Indians want. We wanted to create a space about what do we imagine a post-Indian Act future in Canada to look like. So those ideas came together, and this format is where we are today. The format is going to be interesting because it's similar to the TED Talk structure. So we'll have invited presenters come up and speak for 20 minutes each. The two first presentations will be by Chelsea Vowell and by Craig Blacksmith. And then we'll take a break. And during the break, we want you to have engaged, active conversation. So if you're on the live stream, start emailing to the Idle No More Regina website, and let's have a conversation that way. If you're in the room and you're one of those visual learners, there is a whiteboard up here. Pop some questions up. If there's an idea that really resonated with you, make it obvious on the board. If there's somebody you want to go and have a chat with, please do that during that time for break. After that break, we're going to come back into the room, and you're going to hear from Alex Wilson, and then you'll hear more from me. And then you'll have a chance to regroup again and kind of focus your attention on some really important key questions for you that are emerging, or some pieces that really you feel passionate about. So we'll have time to come together, have some informal conversation, and then we'll ask all of the speakers to join us up here for panel discussion, so you'll have a chance to ask them some questions in a really directed way. So that's the format for our day today. And at the end, we'll come together as we enjoy doing and share a lunch together. And know that the conversation isn't over, but it hopefully will continue on in some new ways as you return to your circles of influence in wherever you've come from. Anyway, that's kind of the plan for the day. We ask you to bring your vigorous conversation and your passions and your curiosities and your insights to this conversation, because it isn't something we have in isolation. It should be something that we have together as Canadians. Anyway, enjoy the day. I'm going to ask Jay to introduce our first speakers, and I'll be back in a few minutes.
Hi there. My name is Jason Bird. I work at the University of Regina as an Aboriginal support coordinator. I also work on behalf of Idle No More here in Regina locally with various groups that we've all started and been doing stuff for about a year. So I want to introduce the first presenter. Let's get into this. The first presenter's name is Chelsea Vowell, and I put up her blog that she's been doing for quite a while. But in the past year, it's kind of caught fire, and it's made it into different online publications, and people have come here and visited and read a lot of the stuff that she's been talking about. And kind of a little mini bio of her is actually on here, so that actually helps me. She's obviously a Métis lady, Plains Cree speaking, Lac Sainte Anne, Alberta, lives in Montreal, Quebec, and her passions are education, Aboriginal law, Cree language, which she does speak, and roller derby, oddly enough. Holds a Bachelor of Ed and an LLB. I'm guessing that's lawyer or something right there? Okay. And teaches Indigenous youth. So we're going to get her to come up. She's going to have 20 minutes to speak. Again, today's topics, we're looking at Indigenous governance and post-Indian Act world, potentially. So let's give her a round of applause.
I'm short. So I guess I'm stuck here with the microphone. I usually like to pace, but tanse nitsika son Chelsea Vowell igwa mantu sak eigene kotsinia pito kosasan skonia apo otpem su skoel ni mewitam uta ki waptin wow. So my name is Chelsea Vowell from Lac Sainte Anne, which is it's a Métis settlement west of Edmonton. And so my blog name is Apitawa Gosasan, which means Métis. That's the Cree word for Métis. It actually means like half son. We have another name for ourselves. We call ourselves the people who are their own bosses. So when we're feeling like that, but I'm fine with this. This is fine. So I guess what I wanted to talk about really is relationships. I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to have to sort of roll through this. So I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to some of you about this more later. When the question is asked, what do you guys want? And when we conceive of a post-Indian Act future, so first of all, the Indian Act is obviously a stand-in for more than just the Indian Act. It's a whole set of colonial policies and laws that have been in place in Canada for centuries. And my answer to that question, what do you guys want, is always, I want a healthy relationship, because I feel that right now we're in a very abusive relationship and have been for quite some time. If we think of everything through a series of lenses, relationship lenses, we shift the focus away from always worrying about individual rights and economy, and how do those two things play off one another, and when are rights less important than economic success, things like that. If we look at it in terms of relationships, then we have to figure out, how are we going to live together? And that's not a question that actually gets asked enough, I think. How are we going to live together? Clearly, we already are living together, but it's not in a good way. When Europeans first arrived here, we have this idea that they just came as this huge conquering horde and imposed all their laws and took over and just bossed everyone around right away. But that's not how it happened. When they first came here, they were very much at the mercy of the elements. They very much needed the help of the peoples who they encountered at first. And those relationships were pretty decent. I'm living in Montreal right now, so I've had the opportunity to hear a lot about the history from out there. And the peace and friendship treaties are exactly that, peace and friendship. They weren't about land. They weren't about imposing sovereignty. They were about figuring out how these people were going to live on the land with people who knew how to live on the land. And they were based along the idea of mutual respect and non-interference. We'll do our thing over here, you do your thing over there, and never the twain shall cross. Okay, so if you've ever seen the two-row wampum, which is basically on a white background with two purple or blue lines running parallel, okay, those lines don't cross. You stay in your canoe, we stay in our canoe, and we can get along. And that's a metaphor for a relationship that we can have in the future, okay, where we agree to live on the land because there's no boats waiting to pack people up and leave. There just aren't. We're here to stay. Everybody's here. So if we can find a way to keep the things that are important to us and still get along, then that's what we want to be reaching for. Okay, so how do we do that? One of the first things we need to look at is land. And this is something that scares a lot of people, because I think that there's this idea that if we have any sort of redistribution of land, that it's going to create a balkanization of Canada, that we're just going to split up into a bunch of tiny little nation states. Okay, get the nation state idea out of your head. For one thing, I think Canada is not one united country anyway. If you, you're in the prairies, and the prairies are different than the Atlantic provinces, and are different than the North, and is different than the West Coast, and those differences are real. Those differences are not just regional aspirations. Those differences are based on the land. Okay, the land creates contours and relationships and requires things of you. Okay, so what is required of you in one area is going to be different than if you're living in the far north. Okay, those requirements are obviously different. So we need to start talking about all of our relationship with the land, because no one exists outside of it. Even if you're living in the city, you're still getting your food from the land, you're still getting your air and your water, and all of that is interconnected. And I think that for a lot of people living in Canada, we're unhappy with the way that the land is being dealt with. I'm not going to say managed, because that's a totally different concept here. So none of us are particularly happy with the fact that we don't individually have a lot of control over what happens in the lands here. What I'd like to see is a recognition that as people who are living on the land, that we need to have a healthy relationship with the land. That sounds like a lot of mumbo-jumbo hippie crap, okay? I know it does. But the fact is that Canada is very much basing its economy on resource extraction, and the rest of it is all service industries that are serving the resource extractors. And so when First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people want to talk about changing things, about having more control over their territories, about having more say over what's going on, that immediately threatens the entire economic base of Canada. So I understand why there's a lot of resistance to even having this discussion. Okay, so let's not think about the economy. Let's think about this building a healthy relationship. And one of the ways that we do that is we, as Indigenous peoples, can start looking beyond asking for permission to take control over our territories and make our own decisions, and just start doing it. It sounds simple. or maybe it sounds crazy, but it's actually working in some places. In Listigooch First Nation, there was a fisheries raid in 1981 that really sort of polarized the community. Fisheries officials came in and were beating people, were arresting people. It was a really traumatic event for that community, and it was all over the salmon fishery. And the Listigooch Mi'kmaq had been fishing the way that they always have been, and suddenly they were saying, no, you can't do that anymore. We've got federal laws. And after that, the community really came together and they said, look, we can't. This is the basis of our entire culture. All of our laws, all of our traditions, they're based on the salmon, on the fishery. So they came together and they said, look, we have good laws in place. We know how to manage the fisheries. Let's just do it. And that's what they did. They created their own fishery officials, people that would go out and actually enforce Mi'kmaq law, and it is now one of the most successful fisheries in Canada. Canada never said, yes, you can do it. The Mi'kmaq never asked Canada, can we do it? And they've sort of had this truce that, okay, yeah, you go ahead and you take care of that area. This is what I'd like to see more of. If we want to talk about sovereignty and self-determination, we can't just talk about it, we have to live it. One of the ways that we can live it, one of the ways that we can experience it every day is through our language. And in our languages, we have all of our traditions, we have all of our pedagogies, we have all of our laws. And if you don't focus on bringing the language back, I think that what you're going to do is you're going to end up using translations for concepts which cannot be easily translated. When I talk about law, immediately you're thinking about Canadian law, whether you want to or not. Or you're thinking about Law and Order, you're thinking about, Aaron Brockovich, stuff like that. But you get all these images in your head immediately, right? And so what you're doing is you're importing a whole history and culture into the word law. So when we talk about Cree law or Dene law or Inuit law, it just sounds like sort of a dressed up version of Law and Order. Okay, so we have to sort of step away from that. We have to step away from these translations and think about the concepts in our own languages and what they mean. And all of the concepts bring us back to relationships. They all tell us what our reciprocal obligations are to one another, to the plant and animal nations, and to the land. And I use this term plant and animal nation, and a lot of people go like, what? What I'm referring to there, and I want to keep using that term, is that among a lot of Indigenous peoples, there's this idea that humans are not there to be on top of everything and exploit in order to assert ownership. Okay, that's a very Eurocentric idea, that in order to be a human, you have to exploit things and say it's yours. That's the Eurocentric model. And whether you agree with it, if you come from that background or not, it nonetheless really shapes all of the philosophies and laws and political culture that come from that. In a lot of Indigenous cultures, the idea is that human beings are just another group of animals with a certain set of obligations and responsibilities. And the other nations are also important. So where I'm from, my people have a treaty with the Beaver Nations. Okay, we don't hunt them. We don't eat them the same way that they're hunted and eaten elsewhere. I mean, obviously there was a disruption in this treaty with the fur trade. Okay, but the beavers provided us with a very, very useful skill, right? They dam up waters and they create lakes, which eventually become stocked with fish. They create these sort of wonderlands for us, so we don't have to keep going abroad so much. So that relationship that we have with the Beaver Nation is really important. We have obligations to them, and they do things for us, okay? So if we think about that, if we use that as a metaphor, I mean, you can use it as a metaphor, I'm not. I'm using it as literal. For how we relate to all of the life forms living here, okay? What are our obligations to them? What are they providing for us that we need to value? And what is the impact of our actions having on everybody else, okay? These are questions that environmentalists ask. These are questions that Canadians are starting to ask. But these are things that are actually not written, but whatever. They're in our laws. This is actually part of Indigenous law. So going back to the idea of how can we move forward, I think one of the ways is that non-Indigenous people, you guys have a wealth at your fingertips in terms of your access to Indigenous law, especially like here in the prairies where the population is very high. There's a lot of fluency and a lot of people who are really doing the work to bring back the traditional laws. if you are trying to think of things outside of that paradigm of man on top, everything else on bottom to be exploited, then you don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've got a lot of those concepts in our cultures, and we're really trying to share those with you because they're really important to us, and we're trying to live them. And I would really, really welcome you to learn more about them. And one of the ways that you can learn more about them is just through little bits of language, okay? Because the language that we use to name landscapes, that we use to mark historic occasions, those things are going to give you a little bit of insight into the history of the land that you're living on. And wherever you come from, whether you're from Regina or you're from, somewhere else, please find out whose territory you're living on, okay, and learn a little bit of the language. That's going to be your in to starting to understand the traditional laws of that place. And there is room for the diversity of Indigenous laws that exist in Canada. There is more than enough room. Okay, we can coexist. It's not going to balkanize us, because ultimately, as individual people, we all have to live here. We all know that our children have to live here and our grandchildren have to live here, and none of us want to leave a stinking, heaping ruin for them. We just don't. But a series of bad decisions and people who are making decisions about what happens on land that they don't have to live on, okay, that's really what's making a mess of everything, okay? So if we start looking at supporting Indigenous self-determination, what does that mean? That means becoming involved in it. It's not something that can happen with you set apart in your own little area doing your own thing necessarily, okay? How am I for time?
7 minutes.
7 minutes? Sweet. Okay. Give me a moment. So moving beyond the Indian Act is going to require a heck of a lot of effort. Okay, it really is, because the status quo is easy and inertia is a real thing. Okay? It's really easy to just keep letting things being bad. And when we focus on all the bad things, on the fact that our schools are underfunded, Indigenous health is declining, our languages are dying, if we focus on all that, it's just as easy to get overwhelmed and to give up as it is when we start looking at, dead zones in the ocean and just the overwhelming amount of pollution that we're creating. When that's your focus, of course, you're just going to be like, I'm one person, what can I do? I recycle, I do all these I'm a good person, but I can't change it. Okay? So turn the focus over. What can you do as an individual to strengthen your relationships with the people around you and with the land that you live on? Well, there are simple things that you can do. And if we all take those steps, then we set up a series of interconnected relationships that actually make a difference. And that's really what I've seen over this past year. Beyond the drumming and the round dance flash mobs, what people really have been doing in the background is reaching out and forming those relationships. So even if all it is you just learning about the territory you're in. Whose territory is it? What's the history there? What's the language? Do you know any of the words in the language? What does the language mean? And what is your role? Where do you come from? I always introduce myself with where I come from. Well, I would really like you guys to start doing that too. Be like, this is where I'm from. My parents came from Italy. My grandparents came from the Ukraine. Whatever. It's a way of locating yourself in time and space. Okay, what are your historical roots? And what are your roots now, here presently? And how are you going to strengthen those roots? I think that Idle No More sort of reminded a lot of people that we're still here. We became visible in a way that I don't think that we were before, especially out here in the prairies where that was really happening. Just all of a sudden, natives were there, in ways that weren't stereotypically negative. And I think that I'm hoping that our neighbors are waking up and realizing that we're not actually dying off. We've been dying off for 500 years apparently, but we're still here. Okay, and this relationship, this issue of the unhealthy, abusive relationship that Canada has with Indigenous peoples in particular, but also with a lot of Canadians, is not something that we're going to just be able to hope goes away. It's going to take effort. So think about how you can do that. What little bits of effort can you put in to strengthen relationships? And focus on that. Focus on that building instead of all the tearing down negative stuff. I think I'm probably going to end there. I mean, I'm way more interested in actually talking to you guys about this than standing up here preaching. So, kininastaman wow, and thank you very much for having me here.
short pause there. So our next presenter is going to be Craig Blacksmith, and I met him through Idle No More as well. He came out and did a presentation for a group that I was having a conference with. 33-hour presentation, I think it was. And he's going to try to condense a lot of that information today down to 20 minutes. But it's really interesting presentation. That whole 3 hours, I was pretty entranced by some of the ideas and some of the things he talked about and a lot of the history he did bring up. And he's a Dakota man from southern Manitoba. And the Dakotas, he's going to bring up a lot of that background information that they have as well. And I believe that they're going through a court case right now in Manitoba, which is going to be of a lot of interest. And I think that's what he's going to speak about today. So I'll get him to come up here. I'm going to be his media person, trying to move stuff around for him, see if I get everything correct. But Craig Blacksmith.
Good morning. I was asked to come and talk about life past the Indian Act. And when we discuss this, a lot of people think that we're going to die if we don't have the Indian Act. And I'm talking specifically about the Native people. And so we go back to pre-1492, before, and excuse the term, but I'm going to use immigrants, before the immigrants came to our land. Prior to that, we took care of our own people. Nobody was hungry, nobody was homeless. We had our own child care, our own policing, everything. Just that our way of life was different than the immigrants' way of life. They liked the little, the white picket fences, fences around their yards. And so the sharing concept that we had worked for a time, but as the population grew, the expansion slowly spread west. And if up 3? Yeah. So, like Jay was saying, this presentation will take anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. So I'm going to condense it into like 20 minutes here pretty quick. So before we get into this, I'm gonna say some things that are going to anger some people in this room. And I don't mean any disrespect to anybody, so don't take it at heart. All right, this is just a history lesson that we're giving here. Okay, so if I can jog your school days, the blue in there is the United States, 1776. Okay, the western border is the Ohio River Valley. Now, Jay, if you can switch to this one here, the 17. Yeah. That's this booklet here. The court case that Jay is talking about has to do with the Dakota people in Canada. And what the government, what we're dealing with Dakota people is we don't have any treaties with the Canadian government. And the reason for this is Canada says that we're refugees from the United States. So I'm standing up here in the eyes of the Canadian government, a refugee. Right? They say that we ran away from the 1862 Minnesota Uprising and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And so according to the Canada's documents, and some of them will be shown here, but we did some exhaustive research, and this goes right back to British Army records. And maybe if you can just scroll down without, there's actual British letters, correspondence letters, relationship with the Dakotas and the British government. So again, this is based on a treaty, an alliance, and that's what Dakota means. It's an ally. We're your friend. So what Canada says is that, and then you can flip to the 1812. What Canada says is after the War of 1812, and again, it's all recorded in here, all the battles that we took part in. We even had a general with the name of Wabasha. He had 1,000 warriors under him, which is what a general does. He has command over 1,000 troops. So we weren't in British uniform. We were still, as you picture a warrior, and that's the way we fought. And we, at the War of 1812, the western boundary of the United States is now the Mississippi River Valley. And the green is where the Dakota were, like I said, we didn't have borders identifying, this is the Dakota Territory. Wherever the buffalo were, that's where we were. So there's documented battles, Battle of Detroit, Michilimackinac, Prairie du Chien, where we went and, we had a lot of success against the U.S. Army, put it that way. So when you look in the history books, or you look in an encyclopedia, it says that Dakotas and the animosity between the Dakotas and the United States started in 1862 with the Minnesota Uprising. But we've got documentation here that it started 100 years before that. Thomas Jefferson even has a letter in his library saying that he's going to exterminate us. And that language was used again in 1862. So when Canada says that we ran away, we didn't run away. The border in 1812 was formalized, the 49th parallel. And this 49th parallel has been used against us, that somehow this imaginary, or the way they talk about it, it's like there's a force field or a 60-foot Great Wall of China or something that we never crossed. And they do, when they admit that we do cross, they say it was to raid other tribes and for hunting and things like that. And when we talk about history and we look in the history books, we're reduced to a sub-form of life. We're not animal, but we're not human either. We're somewhere in between. And if you really read the history books properly, we've been reduced to that we were taught to walk upright and speak English, and that's an act of grace by the governments, both Canada and the U.S. I'm not separating the two governments, because down in the States they have what they call a Bureau of Indian Affairs. Up here we have Indian Affairs. There's no difference. There's correspondence between the two countries dealing with lack of a better word, Indians. Okay, we can flip to the. Yeah, and then here's 1862. The U.S. is pretty much settled except for the prairie areas. And again, on Canada's side, so the red up top there, does anybody know what that is? That's the BNA Act that was passed. That's Canada in 1867. So this notion that Canada was in existence right across the country here, and same with the United States, isn't true. So in 1867, that was the extent of Canada. 1870, there's another map that shows Manitoba. It was called a postage stamp province, and it was just a little square around between Portage and Winnipeg, and then gradually expansion. Like Saskatchewan and Alberta, they became provinces in 1905. That's 108 years ago. So the history of our people extends way prior to anything that's been going on here in the prairies for the last 200 years, and there's all kinds of documentation to that. Okay, just go according to that paper there. Okay, and here's part of the research that we did. Now, Canada does its own research, and they provide research to us. They have researchers that are hired by the government, and then they produce a piece of paper to us and say, here, this is your history. And all it is basically Indian Affairs, letters, correspondence, back and forth. And if you go into the RG10 file in the Indian Affairs, you can see whole pages blacked out except for a few sentences. And these are done to reinforce the idea that we ran away from the United States. There's no actual documentation. So when we did this, we found what was called the British Parliamentary Select Committee hearings in 1857. 1869, the Hudson's Bay Charter was going to expire, And the British government, by this time, in their dealings with other countries, they knew that this form of government that they had here in Canada wasn't going to work. So the future founding fathers of Canada sat down with the British government, and these are verbatim transcripts. And they're really interesting to read. They're, if anybody's taking notes, dakotoyate.com. The transcripts are available for download there. But they're verbatim transcripts, so it's word for word. You can sit there and read this, right? And in there, if you can see further up here, is Seward, Dakota coming down through there? These documents, they're talking about the Native people that are in this part of the territory, and that's what this map is, Aboriginal map of North America. At that time, this is where the tribes were at that time. And so if like I said, this is a 3-hour presentation kind of condensed into, a couple of minutes, right? But the northern part of this boundary is the Yellowhead Highway. And that's, anything south of there was considered our territory. And the way they talk about us is, it's kind of, it's derogatory but respectful in a way. They talk about the Plains tribes as being bold, warlike people, and we have no control over them. And this belief that we had given to us, and this is from elders, is if your grandfather, your great-great-grandfather gave your family property or gave you something that you were supposed to hang on to for the benefit of your grandchildren, what right do you have to sell that? So this belief is where we don't believe in selling the land or surrendering. And so flip to the next. So that map there pretty much blew Canada's defense out of the water that were refugees from the United States. And again, they have their own researchers that conduct research, and there's huge binders, but they only go to certain limits. They won't expand. They won't include any of these things that we have in their research. Okay, so last August 8th, Jay was saying that we're involved in a court case. We took Canada to court in July 24th of 2009. And in there, Canada gave a statement of defense. It says that they have no prior knowledge of Dakotas as being resident north of the 49th parallel. And they continue on and they say there was no fraud or any misrepresentation dealing with the Dakota people. Now, the big problem with this is language. Now, if we had an elder standing up here talking in Dakota to this group here, how many people in here would understand what that elder is saying, right? So what does Canada do? Or what did the government do? They'll get somebody to interpret for him. And the way they interpret is word for word. So you remember the little character Yoda in Star Wars? You take our language and you translate it word for word, our elders are all going to sound like Yoda. The interpretation isn't correct. So in order for you to understand what our elders are saying, that's where somebody like me comes in. I have to explain this from our elders' perspective in a way that you'll understand. Okay, so last August 8th, we took a sovereign stance as Dakota people. Okay, the Canadian government doesn't want to deal with us. They put our court case in abeyance, the federal one. So our next avenue was how are we going to exercise their sovereignty? So we took it upon ourselves to make an agreement, economic agreement with the Haudenosaunee, the Mohawks, and they sell tobacco on their own, and they're in a big hassle with the Quebec and the Ontario governments over that. But they are doing it. They've been doing it now for 18 years. So we took it on ourselves that we notified the province, we notified Canada, this is what we're going to do. We didn't ask for permission, we just told them what we were going to do, same as a young lady was saying back there. So of course the province comes back and says, you can't do that. So our leader said, well, we're not asking you, we're telling you, we're exercising our sovereignty. If you claim to have jurisdiction over the Dakota people, then prove it. Show us a piece of paper where we agree to surrender our rights and to the government. And so the biggest problem we have is that we have to prove that we were always here. Okay, so the map and everything else like that, we gave it to them, and this is the concession from the provincial government last August 8th. It says, for the purpose of the pre-trial motion challenging the court's jurisdiction, Crown is willing to concede that the Dakota people used or occupied southern Manitoba prior to Confederation before the assertion of Crown sovereignty. Before the assertion of Crown sovereignty, remember that. The Crown is also willing to concede that Dakota First Nations of Manitoba have not signed treaty with Canada, ceding any asserted rights or title to land in southern Manitoba. Please note that the Crown's concessions are for the purpose of the pre-trial jurisdiction motion only and may not be relied on for any other purpose. So our claim was jurisdiction. We opened up the store off the reserve. We got raided 6 times, and we kept opening up. And so finally we get to court. Okay, so rather than having to deal with our people being here all the time, the province conceded that we were always here, no treaty with Canada, right? We've never surrendered our rights. Okay, and then the last paragraph. It is the Crown's position that regardless of whether the Dakota First Nation have Aboriginal title to the land, sovereignty vests in the Crown. Sovereignty vests in the Crown. Federal provincial laws of general application apply to the Dakota people. This includes the Tobacco Tax Act, Retail Sales Tax Act. Okay, so now we get to the real crux of the matter here. How is it that Crown sovereignty supersedes Aboriginal sovereignty? What is it about an Aboriginal that puts us underneath the Crown? And you think about the Crown, people talk about the Royal Proclamation like it's some special thing. The Royal Proclamation, if people take the time to read it, it's a letter by the King of England at the time. Guy sitting with a crown on his head and his advisors write a letter. Nobody else can buy land or purchase land or negotiate land with the Indian people except me. That's what the Royal Proclamation is. And then he's got a list of all the native bands. There's an A list and a B list. And this is what Canada relies on. And yet in Canada's Statement of Defense, I think we should be, yeah. Oh, just as a note here, when the Crown conceded this, the Crown attorneys, when we left the courthouse, they turned around and they said, you realize if you hang on to this position, you keep this position, you're going to unravel Canada, he says. Well, that's not, that's not our point. We just want to be treated like people, like human beings, right? Okay. Yeah, there it is. So we don't have, the other thing too with this court case is we don't have lawyers. And the reason we don't have lawyers is that if anybody in here is a lawyer, or if anybody is striving to get their law degree, in order for you to practice law in Canada, you have to swear allegiance to the Crown, and you have to uphold the Canadian Constitution. So this here, defendants assert that they're not bound by provincial law because they do not relinquish their sovereignty through treaty. In essence, they argue that the Dakota people, our sovereign nation, is not subject to the rule of law in Canada. With respect, no court has countenanced such an argument. Now, because we don't have lawyers, we received a stack of binders about this big, all the evidence against us. And in there they had this. The Crown is so arrogant that they gave us all the possible defenses that we could use and how they were going to beat us. And what they're using is Section 35, Section 91. Section 91 is the Indian Act. Section 35 is Aboriginal rights. You scroll down, just scroll down. This one here. Okay, this is the Sparrow case. This is relied on exclusively by the Supreme Court. It says that it is worth recalling that while British policy towards the native population was based on respect for the right to occupy their traditional lands, a proposition to which the Royal Proclamation of 1763 bears witness, there was from the outset never any doubt that sovereignty, legislative power, title to the land vested in the Crown. Now just break that sentence down. From the outset. From the outset, meaning day one, when they set foot on our shores. A young lady was saying that when they first came here, They were at the mercy of the elements. There were people that were dying. It's recorded. We helped them. As soon as they got a foothold, that's when the destruction started. And it's still going on today. So we'll just scroll down some more. There's a, yeah. Okay, 55. To the extent that the defendants claim that they have an Aboriginal right to sell contraband tobacco. Now this word, Aboriginal, Canada says we don't. In the federal court, they say we don't have Aboriginal rights. Manitoba Crown is saying that we do. Okay, so just think about that for a second. To anyone to choose off reserve without any obligation to collect or remit provincial taxes owed by third-party purchasers, the Attorney General submits that such claim must be proved with sufficient evidence at trial to meet the Van der Pee test for Aboriginal rights established by the Supreme Court of Canada. Well, that court case involved a lady that had a right to sell fish in BC. Her common law husband apparently he wasn't Aboriginal enough. So they developed a test, the Van der Pee test, to decide whether or not Jay is an Aboriginal or not. So again, this comes back to the Indian Act again. What is an Indian? What's an Aboriginal? What's Indigenous? What's First Nation? All of these terms are used throughout this legal language. And again, whatever that Aboriginal or Indian is, it's not a human being. Crown sovereignty supersedes Aboriginal sovereignty. Crown title supersedes Aboriginal title. That's the following right through there. And there's that package that we got, like I said, it's a big stack of binders. And they've got all these court cases in there. And there's one, R versus Williams. 1846 Oregon Boundary Treaty supersedes all Aboriginal laws, Indigenous laws, north of the 49th parallel. Now, Oregon Boundary Treaty is made with, and again, lack of better word, the immigrants, right? So how is it that the immigrants can make a law that supersedes our laws? Nobody, they talk about consultation with the government. Well, there's no consultation with any of this. None of this. Like I said, we're not really human, so we basically grunted and ate berries. That's the way we're being portrayed. And so life beyond the Indian Act, I don't know what the next one is. Yeah. We talk about treaties, and the spirit and intent of treaties, and treaty this and treaty that. And like I said, I'm going to offend some people, but it has to be done. Okay. So page 4, paragraph 4. This is a Canadian treaty. Okay. Very few people have ever read these treaties. They just go by what they're being told, what the lawyers tell them. No, page 3.
One part.
No, you're on page 3 right now. There you go, right there. This paragraph here. The Cree and Solo tribes of Indians, all other Indians inhabiting the district, hereinafter described in the fine, do hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government of Dominion Canada for Her Majesty the Queen and her successors forever, all of their rights, title, and privileges whatsoever. Every treaty, the number of treaties are like this, 1 to 11. This is not a treaty, this is a surrender document. You're surrendering your rights, everything, and then they've got a land description. And yet the lawyers are telling our leaders, you have treaty rights. But have they ever taken a look at the actual treaty themselves? No, they haven't. And then they say, well, no, that's not what our elders talked about. They're talking about the spirit and intent of treaties. What is a treaty based on? Peace, friendship, and equality. There's no peace, no friendship, no equality with that document right there. And when they say Canada isn't enforcing the treaty, sure they are. They're enforcing that with the Indian Act. And so our court case, even though it related to our people, I can't speak for anybody else, but this is the way the government thinks of us. This is the way the government's treated us from day one. There is not an elder in the land anywhere that would agree to this. So why did they put their marks on there? because somebody translated it for them and told them this is peace, friendship, and you're sharing the land and so and so. There's none of that in there. And if you scroll down to the bottom, it says, and to be good and loyal subjects. So what happens when any Native leader tries to stand up for his people? Cut his funding, or threaten to cut his funding. That's what's happening to they're called PTOs, provincial territorial organizations. That's your FSIN, your AMC. They're all getting their funding cut right now because they're trying to stand up for the people and they're not being allowed to do that. No, it's further up. Yeah, there we go. No, further up. Yeah, it's at the end of the tree. You just. Yeah. There. Undersigned chiefs, headmen, on behalf of all other Indians and having the tract within ceded hereby solemnly promise and engage to strictly observe this treaty and also conduct and behave themselves as good and loyal subjects. That's not a treaty. Next, whatever the next one is. Okay. Okay, so now we're talking treaties, and Canada says in their statement of defense that there's no corruption, no mismanagement, no nothing. J.N. Provencher is the superintendent of Indian Affairs in the 1870s. He had a hand in all of those first 5 treaties. And this guy, Alexander Morris, was getting feedback from the people that had signed treaties. We're not getting what we're supposed to be getting. So then he starts questioning Provencher and the government. Where's the funds? There's supposed to be funds to pay for this and that. Provencher turns around, he says, oh, the Indians are drunk and they just want stuff and they keep wanting stuff and they want more and more. Canada says, we sent the money. So this investigation, Morris wasn't getting any answers, so he started an inquiry. And in this inquiry, Provencher is found guilty of fraud. Not just Provencher, the Attorney General of Manitoba is also involved in this. The Attorney General of Manitoba told all the people that were supposed to be questioned not to provide testimony. The Attorney General of Manitoba is telling people not to get involved in this inquiry. Provencher didn't show up for the meetings. He was sick. He's doing all these kinds of things. And the things that this guy did, and this always surprises me with with people involved in fraud. He kept a detailed record of what he did. To appease Alexander Morris, he made up invoices. He faked invoices. And there's a group called McMicken and Sons, and there's other suppliers like this. We're talking about Canada in its infancy, so you only have a few suppliers. You only have a few. So he was in cahoots with all of them. Now I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Homestead Act, right? Homestead Act gave a parcel of land, 160 acres per family of 5. Now those treaties, the good thing about the treaties is that the treaty one that signed those, they got 160 acres per family of 5. What happened was because Native people don't, like I said, we don't put borders around our property, we congregate in one area, right? So then you have land that's not being used according to the immigrants. So they start taking the land away. So now 110 years later, we have what they call the TLEs, Treaty Land Entitlement benefits, right? So there's no land to give away, so they give them money. Here's money. It's put in a trust account for you. You can go buy land. Now you go take that land and you go buy some perfectly good property, and what do? Well, the government says, we'll convert that to reserve for you. Okay, this is great. We'll be tax exempt. They convert the reserve, or to convert the land to reserve. What just happened? Under the Indian Act, who owns the land? Who owns reserve land? The government. You just gave the money back or gave the land back to the government again. And this is the kind of, and it's the lawyers that are doing this to us, doing this kind of thing. So anyway, this INAC and the fraud, everything else goes way back right to the beginning. I think we're done? Yeah. Okay. Just closing, you're going to hear a lot of talk about self-government, right? This self-government says that we're going to get out of the Indian Act, okay? I'm going to read, just give me a minute here. No, I'm not going to mention the First Nation here, but you can see this later if you want to. It says, continued application of the Indian Act. Subject 2 through 5, the Indian Act continues to apply to so-and-so First Nation and all persons found on these lands. Definitions for the purposes of the Indian Act. For the purposes of these sections, regulation of the Indian Act which continue to apply for said First Nation. Said First Nation is deemed to be a band. The First Nation band is deemed to be a council of the band. Register of said band is deemed to be a registration under the Indian Act, deemed to be the band list. Seashelt, West Bank have self-government agreements. You can look them up online. They're still under the Indian Act, even though they say they're not under the Indian Act. And as long as we're under the Indian Act, we're under the control of the government. So post-Indian Act, we're people, and we have rights, and we have our access to our resources. And we can take care of ourselves pre-1492. We don't need anybody to feed us. Those days are gone. We can look after ourselves. So, closing, thank you very much.
Well, folks, we're halfway through the morning. And at this time, we'd invite you to join us for something to munch on, have some coffee. I'll do a couple housekeeping pieces with you. The bathrooms are down the hall and to the right. And we'll be regrouping in about 15, 20 minutes, Jay? So please engage with one another in conversation, post some questions, talk about the things that really resonated with you today. And we'll see you again in a few minutes. For those folks who are on live stream, we'll see you too. Bye.
She sent me. I'll try to get the words correct. So feel free to grab some snacks, water, coffee, to get ready for this presentation. Alex Wilson is a Nanoe, Innu, from Opaskwayak Cree Nation, Associate Professor of Education, Director of Aboriginal Education at the Research Centre and University of Saskatchewan. Her academic and community work and passion focus on Indigenous land-based education and social ecological justice. As an Idle No More organizer, Alex uses education and Cree philosophy to intervene in ongoing practices of colonialism, oppression, and the destruction of land and water. So I'd like to welcome Alex Wilson up here to do her presentation, which I'll kind of be helping her with the media part of it. So, Alex Wilson.
Thanks, Jason. Tansi. Thanks for the invitation, and I'd like to also thank the people from Treaty 4 territory and pre-Treaty 4 territory. I appreciate the invitation to be here on your land. And so the question we are asked is, what would the world look like post-Indian Act? And that's kind of what we had turned that off so we could show this. Maybe just one of them. Okay, so if you go to the next slide there, the next. People people who know me will say, oh, why does she always start with that? For the past 10 years, all my presentations have started with this. And the reason for that is because, to me, this kind of encapsulates a few million years of history. And because we only have 20 minutes, a picture is worth a few million words in this case. And so this tells the story of our origin. And that story has us coming from this land. And linking back to what Chelsea was talking about earlier, there's a key part of this, and that is the interrelatedness, that we are all connected in some way. And with that connection is a responsibility and accountability. And, there's key characters in this as well, but I won't go into that. But I like to start that way just to acknowledge the land that we're on and the connection we have as Indigenous people that goes well beyond 500 years. Okay. So I'm from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation. There's the coordinates if any of you have GPS and you want to come and visit. The place that you can see, it's part of the Saskatchewan River Delta, over 2 million square hectares of land that are all connected through waterways. And we know this now, that the Saskatchewan River Delta is one of the largest freshwater deltas in the world and also endangered. You'll see Lake Winnipeg on the right here, one of the largest freshwater lakes also on the entire planet, #1 endangered freshwater lake. And so where I come from is very intimately connected to this waterway system. And so those of us that are living there are seeing firsthand how climate change is affecting us as humans. The place in particular in Opaskwayak, where my family is from, is called Pamuskatapan. And that means the place where you have to get out of your canoe and pull it. And I think for those of us that have been involved in Idle No More, all of us here, I think that is kind of metaphoric as well, because Idle No More has been, we've been coasting along. Canada's been coasting along. And now, we're at a time when we're going to, start directing the flow of things, and that's basically what Idle No More has done. It's kind of disrupted the flow that everybody sees as natural, as equaling Canadian, and saying, wait a minute, no, we have people that have been here for a long time, and it's time for us to maybe start taking the lead on these issues. Okay. So the question, what would the world look like in a post-Indian Act time? Some people think that maybe what's going to happen. So there's opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So according to the federal government, this might be the outcome if we got rid of the Indian Act. And then on the other end of the spectrum is this. It's kind of twinkly if you see it on the internet, but again, it's like the opposite end, right? That it's just going to be rainbows, feathers, lollipops, and unicorns or something. But the reality is neither of the two. So if you go to the next slide, I want to use some examples, some concrete examples, and education, because I'm involved in the field of education, that's probably what I know best. I'm also working in the field of health, so I'll look at this issue from a population health approach, meaning that the social impacts of, or the social potential of a post-Indian Act era. And so we have all these models of education that have existed, and you'll notice the first one is Indigenous. And that is the model that we had for well over 50,000 years. It was an effective model. It worked. It was sustainable. Everybody was educated in that model. It was localized to a community, to a geography, to a language, and to cultures. And it worked. It was holistic. Then we had the assimilation and enfranchisement era that came about in the 1800s with Canada. And then we have all these other things that have happened since then. Where we are now is to a point where we're returning to an Indigenous, or we need to return to an Indigenous model of education. And by education, I don't necessarily mean sitting in a classroom with a chalkboard or a smartboard. It's every way that we can imagine education can and should be. So about transforming our knowledge system, of translating knowledge into practice, of having elders share their knowledge. It's knowledge mobilization and all those catchphrases you hear. But what it basically is sustaining ourselves in a healthy way as happy humans. And so I think that all of us are involved in probably some aspect of the education system, whether it's formalized or not. And I think that this is basically where Idle No More comes in. And so that term Indigenist there, some people may not be familiar with, but what that is implies that an Indigenous way of thinking or way of being in terms of education can be open to other people as well. We know that the education system in Canada has failed Indigenous people, but what we're also seeing is that it also hasn't been the best for other populations as well. And so here's an opportunity for non-Indigenous people now to learn from Indigenous communities. And I think that many educators, scientists, etc., have said now's the time when we need to let Indigenous people kind of pull us through, pull that boat or pull that canoe, that we can learn from Indigenous people, because we have been able to live healthily and happily on this land mass for so long. And we need to return to that point if we're going to actually have a future as human beings. And okay, so that's to me what Idle No More is all about. And so Idle No More is framed within an Indigenous understanding of our connection to the land, and that has always been the thing that has led the Idle No More movement. And so I think it's very significant that we're here 1 year after the day that that you and Regina had your first Idle No More event, and the first time the round dance was associated with the Idle No More movement is significant as well, which some people called the round dance revolution. So thank you, Regina people, for that, because we know that round dancing isn't just a bunch of people dancing in a circle. It is bringing that collective energy that has existed from the beginning of time together with Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. And it's about movement. It's people dancing, moving together. And so that is a returning to this original model, if you want to call it that. And so what I'd like to kind of focus on now in this limited amount of time is some things that are really already post-Indian Act, because I think this is also relating to the Idle No More movement and, all the actions that we've all been doing way prior to Idle No More. Like, all of us were involved in many different things before that, but Idle No More seems to be the nexus, or brought us all together at least, in a conversation that's leading us in the same kind of round dancer together. And so there's some educational models or educational things that are happening right now that are already post-Indian Act. And if you go to the next slide, there's some examples here. And so to me, and to most people, I would say, we recognize the importance of our connection to the land. Land is primary. Land is a primary thing in our worldviews. And land is kind of what's united us. And the fear that we're destroying the land. And land includes water. It includes plants, animals, and all other life forms. And these are just 3 examples, but Dechinta is a bush school up in the north, and what they're doing is they're using the local Dene culture, language, traditions, geography, location, etc., to help kids and adults reconnect with their relationship to the land. And you can see some people tanning hides there. That's part of it. And so they have a curriculum that is linked intimately to the land. And then University of Manitoba has a camp up in Nunavut, same thing. They're training teachers how to use land and how to use land as curriculum. Another one is the University of Saskatchewan. I'll just put a plug in for them because I don't have to, but just because I think this is a really great program. And from what I can tell, it's one of the few, like these other ones, that uses land as the primary text. So what has happened in the past few hundred years is that Indigenous languages have been translated into text. Some have, some haven't actually. But there's become in an educational institution this notion that written text is like the primary form that we gain, primary way that we gain knowledge. And that isn't true, because we know for 50, 60,000 years, Cree people have used land as the text. And so some of us have been kind of disconnected to that text through all these colonial policies that other people have been talking about. And education system has done that as well. And so as a way to undo that, or to recognize the importance of land, go canoeing. Go sit and talk with elders, learn from elders, feel the land, smell it, breathe clean air. All of these things, like, they seem so simple. Obviously, they should be human rights, but we know that they're not, because many First Nations, 1/3 in fact, don't have clean water to drink. So how is that even possible when we have an abundance of the world's fresh water? We're buying bottled water because we have to, right? So it is really essential and critical that education include the land, from my perspective, and others as well, I would say. So the land-based masters is a way that's trying to do that. And so, I was invited to Taiwan, and I just got back from there. And one of the reasons why I'm kind of stuffed up is because the air there is so polluted. And I really did not realize how much I take for granted just breathing clean air until I got home here. I was so thankful for that. But then you see other parts of the world, parts of Canada as well, where just that act of breathing is not available to everybody, breathing clean air. And then you realize, when did this become the norm? Like kids living in Taiwan, how can that be normal, that they do not even notice that you can't see a kilometer away because the air is so polluted, So if you go to the next slide here, this is, if you go to the next one, sorry. So the reason why I was invited there was because Taiwan government has made a commitment to Aboriginal education. There are 14 tribes there, and the president there said that every country in the world should have Indigenous issues as their priority, which is pretty amazing for a world leader to say. And so they have started that commitment, and they were asking us to come and give advice, but really I learned way more from them than they could ever learn from me about that. And so they've got 3 Aboriginal schools that are based on language, land, and culture, and they have plans for 30 more in the next couple of years. And all of this done with very little money. And so we always think about resources and being limited by money, but really you just need to walk outside. Take your class outside if you're a teacher. Take your kids outside, look at the stars. And some of that knowledge will start to come to you when you start noticing patterns again, or when you start smelling the air or listening to the geese and things like that. And so here, this is one of the schools. So the kids are, using bows and arrows. And I thought, why, I wonder why they're learning that. There's no animals here, right? Because this is a village, an Indigenous village. but it's in an urban area. So, but still, it's the movement of your body that's going to remember, things that your ancestors have done for thousands and thousands of years, and they take so much pride in that. The other thing about this school is you can see up on the roof there that it's all solar, so it's self-sufficient, it's sustainable, done with zero money. Every classroom also has technology, which I find interesting, Indigenous technology, but also Western technology. They all have computers, smart boards, and all of that, which I found fascinating. And so elders are involved because many of the elders, the kids' parents don't speak the Indigenous languages, but their grandparents do. And because the grandparents are retired, they come to school and they sit with the kids and teach them the language. Their language, like ours, languages, are not written. And they're not making an attempt to write it down, which I thought was also kind of interesting because we've spent so much money and resources trying to document the Cree language, for example. But really, we have all these ways in our culture already to remember the language. We just have to bring that back. So songs, pictographs, dance, all of those things, paddling, all of those remind us of Cree language in every act that we do when you're on the land. And then, again, commitment's important. So if you go back one slide. So this, I think, is another great example of the People's Free University. So this is people that are educators or in whichever way you want to define education, providing free classes to the community. And I think this is a model that that we can all kind of work towards or do as well, because you don't need any money to do this. All you need is somebody who's willing to teach and people who are willing to collaborate or come in and learn. So I think all of these things kind of undo the structures that we have in place that the federal government has used to regulate us as First Nations people, but also as Canadians. And so once you start doing these kinds of things, you unravel that. And in unraveling, by unraveling I mean you start to crumble this heteropatriarchal culture that we exist in, a triangular model where very few hold all the power and the rest of us have very little power. So something as seemingly simple as a round dance undoes that very structure. Having a free class undoes that. So these are all disruptions, but they're also points of transformation. So depending on which lens you want to come from, they're all ways that Idle No More has contributed to shifting consciousness in Canada, but also beyond. Okay, so, but how do we ensure that the current structure is not replicated? So this is kind of a challenge that we're going to be facing as we continue to move forward into the next year of Idle No More and even beyond Idle No More, because we need to prevent the abuse of power. So when we're returning to a spiritual-based system, there's always that potential for abuse of power, right? And how do we prevent the further marginalization of certain groups in doing that? And so we know that First Nations women, missing and murdered women, we're all aware of that. Gay and lesbian people, Two-Spirit people are marginalized within our own communities. How are we going to ensure that a further marginalization does not occur? And to give an example of that, if you go to the next slide, yeah. I'll use education again. So an example of that is, a lot of schools, and this isn't meant to offend anybody, and I'm sorry if I do, but a lot of schools do smudging now in their classrooms or in their schools. And I get calls about this, people asking, what should we do? Because our school puts boys on one side and girls on the other when we smudge, which was never practiced until, from what I understand, until the 70s, the late 60s. And a lot of elders have told us that, you didn't divide things that way. But the question I get is, where do we put the two-spirit people or the queer people in the circle? My answer is always the same. In the circle, inside it. And how do you divide a circle, right? So these are questions we're going to have to deal with, because this is happening here and happening right now. And so if we want to prevent the further marginalization of women, Indigenous women, and of LGBT or two-spirit youth, we need to start thinking about that. How are we going to address that? How can we say that our spiritual belief system is an energy that includes everybody, and then start to dictate what people can and can't do, what their bodies can and can't do? And I'm relaying this because some of you probably know this, but two-spirit youth have suicide rates that are 10 times higher than any other population. So this is a life or death thing, and you think, well, smudging and our spirituality should be a place that really grounds everybody and makes us all feel good. That's where I get my grounding. And everyone should be entitled to that as a First Nations person. But if a kid doesn't go to school because they don't want to have to make a choice about where they're going to sit, or even how they sit, or what they wear, then we've got a problem. And so these are some things we have to address right now before, as we move forward, I should say, move forward in a loving way. And for trans-identified youth, 46% have attempted suicide. That's almost half. It's incredibly high. Trans people experience violence at rates unbelievably high. And trans-identified kids are dropping out of school as early as grade 3. So what would make a third grader drop out of school? These are serious issues, and I really ask that you do take these things seriously. And it may mean we have to adjust culture and change culture. Our cultures are changing all the time anyway. And so these are things to consider without being offended, but think about them in terms of love and respect. Okay? So a misinterpretation of natural law to equal essentialism means that we have natural laws in our language, as Chelsea talked about, and as Craig talked about, that have existed since our languages came about. And the issue is when they get translated into English, because often they can become dogmatic, and we want to avoid that. Okay? And so this has been a key theme that I've really appreciated about Idle No More, this notion of body sovereignty. Body sovereignty says that the only thing that we really have sovereignty over or control over ultimately is our own bodies and our own actions. And if we don't have that, then how can we have sovereignty as nations? How can we have rights? How can we be self-determined if we don't have that? And so it all begins there. And that also, as part of that, means recognizing the sovereignty of other people's bodies and not imposing rules on them. Sometimes going against convention or going against what the person before you told you. We know that the residential school era lasts a long time, so all of us have incorporated some of those binary understandings of gender into our own belief system, and now we think it's tradition. Gender self-determination is another one. So we know there's a whole spectrum of what gender is and means in Indigenous cultures. There's not just men and women. There's a whole range of what it can mean to be a man or a woman, whole range of what people are good at. If you're good at hunting, you're a good hunter. You become a hunter. And we know when we were surviving for tens of thousands of years, those that were good at paddling paddled. Didn't necessarily have to be a male-bodied person. And so these, again, are issues that we are going to have to continue thinking about addressing in our own lives, and how we conduct ourselves, but also how we regulate others, because the government does a really great job of regulating us, and the Indian Act has regulated every single aspect of our lives, including our bodies and including defining what gender is meant. So now we have an opportunity to say, F that. Sorry. Okay. And so I'd like to return to this Cree underlying philosophy, because to me it kind of guides my understanding and many of my friends and family for sure, where I learned this from a Cree law, Sagihuwewan, which means showing love in our actions. And so that even when we're standing up to somebody, or, speaking our voice, or, saying, don't do that, we are showing love in our actions. So addressing colonialism, addressing racism, addressing sexism and homophobia, that's showing love. Coming out, standing up, saying who you are, being proud to use your language instead of ashamed, that is showing love in our actions. The more that we do that, the more the next generation sees us as, as exemplifying that. Okay. And so here we go into INM 2.0, and I love it. I love it that Winnipeg, I don't know, more people, started using that, and year 2. And so this is the event that's happening in Ottawa today. So they're focusing on the First Nations Education Act and stopping it. And, Tanis Nielsen has done so many great posters for Idle No More, and this is just one of them. And so while we're doing this, they're doing that, and there are many, many events across Canada, but also globally happening right now. The next slide is Winnipeg. And what they've done is that they've said, let's call together all pipe carriers and drummers. So they're returning to that, the spirit part of it. The energy that comes about when you have a group of people thinking and acting in a way that follows that philosophy of love and actions, which is in line with Cree law. And so that's what they're doing as we prepare for the next year. And the next slide here, to me, really is one of my favorite photos from last year, because this kind of encapsulates the movement to me, the energy of the movement. It is about spirituality. It is about Indigenous people. It's about non-Indigenous people as well, but it's about us coming together. And these 4 girls from La Ronge, where nobody had drummed for over 2 decades, these girls came and they revitalized that. Now they have drumming circles up there. They're learning the language. They're using the language. They're practicing. They're outside. They're not on their iPads. They're not playing video games. This is what it's about. And so and the name of the drum group is New Dawn, and I think that's just so appropriate, right, for Idle No More and for where we are today. So that's I think where we're going to continue over the next year. We're going to strengthen that. We're going to, again, protect the land. We have to. We're at a point where we have to. So with that, I just say Kinanaskmitnana, which means I thank all of you, and hope to see you more this year. Thanks.
It's dark up here. Thank you, Alex. So that was our 3rd presenter. So we'll get our 4th presenter to come up. She's actually one of the co-creators of this event. She's an indigenization lead here at the University of Regina, works with the Aboriginal Advisory Circle, with the President's Office here, to help us to move forward at the University of Regina, whether that's faculty or staff, towards indigenization as well. I'm going to get Dr. Shawneen Pete to come up, who works also in the Faculty of Education. She works in everything, basically, let's put it that way. She has a television show coming out on Channel 7. I kid you not. So she's pretty busy. She does a lot of different things. Going to get her to come up, 20-minute presentation and talk about, again, post-Indian Act era. So, Dr. Shawneen Pete.
Yeah, I have to admit, like just right off the bat, like it was stressful enough thinking about the planning of this event because it's so important. It's an important conversation for us to be having. And then Jay and I talked, and he said, "You need to speak," and I was like, "Holy crap!" Now I'm really freaked out because there's such a responsibility with our voices. And when we put something out into the world, we want to make sure that it's good and that it's kind and loving, and that it does no harm. So to begin with, I just want to recognize that the founders were nominated as the top 100 thinkers. And I really appreciate their contributions to our collective conversation, not just in Canada, but also globally. And for them to have taken the time, and so much of their time, and so much of their family time to engage us all in this conversation is just incredibly commendable, and I'm so pleased that they were recognized for this work. We're just going to let that kind of flow through a few times. I'm worried as an Indigenous woman. I'm very worried with the progress of the legislative changes that we've seen to date. I'm worried because I know our communities, and I know my community in particular. I'm from Little Pine First Nation. It's the homeland of my father in Treaty 6 area, and my mother's family are from Cowsas First Nation down here in the valley. And as an educator, I'm worried because I've paid attention to how our graduates who come into our new applicants who come into the Faculty of Ed, their perceptions of what they think their work is going to be, and the reality of what that work is really about. I'm worried because the Economic Action Plan makes certain assumptions about education and employment. They're working from the assumption that if we have more Indian people educated, that somehow that's going to decrease unemployment and increase economic participation and employment. And I suspect that that means they believe that it'll decrease their fiduciary responsibilities to us. So I'm worried about that. And there's a sense of urgency as they march through these legislative changes, pushing us further and faster without time for critique, without time for active resistance to what's being done to us in a lot of ways. And at the same time, they're using financial coercive methods to make people at a band level buy into the models. And they're saying, you don't have a choice or we're not going to fund you, right? Get on that, sign up, do it now. And they're creating this sense of urgency. But I just want to say, wait, urgent for who? It's their urgency. Why? Why are they in such a hurry to create this profound social change for us without recognizing the realities of our community? At Little Pine First Nation, Cowsas, and many other First Nations, our communities are already fragmented. 2/3 of the people from my community live off reserve. We live in Saskatoon, Regina, North Battleford, Edmonton, and elsewhere. And for those who remain on the reserve, there's a real divide between that very young population of under 20-year-olds and those people who are in the retired age, right? So if we're working from the assumption that more of them need to be educated, we've already eliminated some of them, right? So we take out the old folks out of that dialogue. And we focus our attention onto the under 20-year-olds. But we know that in our communities, there's great social disparity, and we do have to talk about the negative aspects of the lived experiences of the folks in our communities. We know full well that the health indicators alone are shocking. The high incidence of FAS and addictions and trauma, sexual abuse, and on and on and on are unequally associated with peoples in our communities. And we know that that's tied up with housing, because when you have overpopulation in housing, there's greater stressors for people's lives. And we can't separate out experiences with poverty and experiences with housing. Those things are intertwined. And food insecurity is tied up with that as well, because how do people who live in poverty feed themselves? How do they take care of their elders? How do they feed their children? Well, they're not really, right? So we have generations of people who've been malnutrition. They have experienced malnutrition in our own homes and in our own communities. And that has an impact on the ability to learn. It has an impact on the ability to move beyond simply surviving in a community. We're really privileged in this space right here, right now. We're really privileged. And I want us to be really upfront about that. We're not dealing with the simple basics of survival. We actually have the privilege of being able to imagine a future beyond the Indian Act. So the health indicators, housing, food insecurity, well, we could talk about the incarcerations and the way that that disrupts families in such a great way, and in great numbers, I mean. And at the same time, the child welfare system is further disrupting our families and our communities. And so with all of these disruptions, I'm really worried. I'm really worried about what this means for us. We have a need for programs and for structures to address social inequality. Certainly, that can't be questioned. But I'm afraid that within this economic action plan, we're simply going to be recreating and re-entrenching dominant structures that have always benefited from the social disparities that are heaped on Indigenous peoples. I'm worried that this means that there's suddenly going to be a need for greater numbers of social workers, police services, people in the jails. I'm worried about that because those folks have really benefited from the social disparity that we've lived with. I'm worried about what this means for educators. I'm worried about the kind of discourses that we need to be having here in the academy to disrupt the social disparity, to question the urgency, and to disrupt that whole industry that is meant to take care of the Indian problem, right? These attempts to increase our economic participation are troubling to me because it really hasn't worked that well for mainstream Canadians, right? There's this huge disparity between those people who have a whole bunch of wealth and a whole bunch of people who have a whole lot of debt. Guess where we're going to be? We're not heading up here. They don't want us to be that successful. They want us to join the ranks of those people with huge amounts of debt. So I worry about the urgency. And I worry about, with this urgency, we don't have this time for the critical conversation. And I suspect that should the Indian Act be just done away with, that for a time, there will be more profound social disparity for our people. I'm worried about the widening of the gap between with those who have so much and those who have so little. And I don't believe that our increased participation will lead us to a good place, an equitable place, a fair place, a safe place. I think it'll actually get much worse. And I wrestled with that this week, this past 2 weeks as I've been preparing for this presentation, because I'm actually a really optimistic person. Otherwise, I wouldn't do the work of indigenizing the university. I mean, really, who does that? Who is that optimistic that they can say, I'm going to go and create profound social change at the university? Really? I mean, you have to kind of have some heart there every day, a whole lot of coffee and, some faith, and it's challenging to maintain that some days. But I'm reminded in the relationships I have with our students that they want something more for their children, that they want something better for their communities. And that gives me hope, that gives me faith, and it pushes me further. What they want us to do is teach them for liberation. They want the skills, knowledge, and experience and the histories that you shared with us earlier. They want to deeply understand that so no one can ever question what they know, so that they can position themselves not just at the same level as Canadians, because that's not so great either. There's a lot of ignorance around Indigenous histories and communities and contemporary issues. We actually have to be better than that. We have to understand our histories so that we can begin to imagine a different kind of future for ourselves in a way that will actually become what we want it to be and what we need it to be. So teaching for liberation is really ultimately the work of indigenizing the academy. And it can't just be done with Add Indian here and stir. That's never worked. It hasn't helped, but it must involve a great deal of decolonizing work as well. Questioning the very knowledge systems, knowledge transmission approaches, the who gets promoted, who gets hired, who gets access, all of it. We have to profoundly transform the academy. And that means having some really tough conversations about some of those things that have to be let go of, because they never privileged us. They never privileged us with access, they never privileged us with our knowledge systems, and they certainly never privileged us with the potential for liberation. I've been up since 4:30. I've been mulling this all over. I agree with all of the speakers today. There's some things that we need to do. There's some things that we need to do within our own families and within our communities and certainly within our organizations. The work of imagining a different kind of future has been something that each generation has taken up. My grandmother, Myra, was a residential school survivor, and she returned to the reserve with a commitment that she wanted to disrupt that system of education. She asked for permission to leave the reserve, and she became a teacher. Okay? And she returned to the reserve and she started a school in the basement of the Anglican Church at Little Pine. And she worked with other women who wanted to disrupt that system too. She taught them to be TAs, and she said to them, let us do this work together. Let us do it in our languages. Let us do it in a way that reflects our knowledge transmission norms. Let us disrupt the system of education. I was in the garden with her one day when I was a little girl, and I said, Kukum, why'd you plant so much stuff? Like, there's way too many potatoes for your cellar. There's way too many carrots here. Like, what are you going to do with all this stuff? And she said to me, we give it away, my girl. And I said, how come you're giving it all away? And she said, because we can, we must. Because we can, we must. Because we can, we must disrupt these systems. We must transform the academies. We must change our communities. We must aspire to something greater. And what might that be? Well, certainly language preservation and revitalization is essential. It helps us to communicate in new ways and in old ways, in ways that are much more effective to communicate our desires. We have to change the curriculum and how we teach, the methods that we teach, both indigenizing and decolonizing along the way. And in relationship to our own children, we have to have some critical conversations sometimes. When my son was in grade 9 or 10, he came home and he says, Mom, I'd really like an iPod. Everybody's got an iPod. You know, so-and-so's mom bought him an iPod. And I said, that's really nice. But I will not deny you ambition, and I will not deny you accomplishment. And if you want something in life, you're going to have to go and work for it. Because I want to disrupt a legacy of dependency, and it starts in our home. Well, that didn't go over really well with my kid, as you can imagine. He stomped off and he said, you're the worst mother ever. Why has it got to be like that? How come you always got answers like that? Because we can, we must. So creating spaces for critical conversations in our homes and in our communities can take us to all different kinds of directions. And certainly in this community here in the University of Regina, we see evidence, if we go digging around, of change attempts over history. You know, who's been to the library? Like, honestly. Okay, about a third of you. The rest of you need to go to the library, if only to go and see those beautiful rugs that are hanging up in the walls. In the 1970s, down in the Fort Capel area, there was an attempt at creating an indigenous economy or an indigenous industry. And women in the community were taught to work together on rug hooking. And through this work, they were able to create and generate revenue for themselves to address some of the issues that would allow them to disrupt dependency on transfers from the government. That project lasted for a time, and certainly the university purchased some of those beautiful rugs that are hanging up there. And that's not a story that everybody knows or understands. I know that story because my mom and dad bought one of those rugs, and we had it in our home for the longest time. But as we begin to deal with some of the disruptions around the social disparities, we're going to have to be very mindful of helping those who have grown despondent because of the disparity. We'll have to give them a hand up, help them out, tell them a different story, say to them, you too can do what you wish to do. You too can dream big. You too can seek an education, perhaps one that'll allow for liberation. But I don't believe that this government's plans for us will take us to a good place. And so our voices on the change process must be at the center of all discussions about our empowered future and about social transformation. We can create that space for the critical conversation in negotiation with one another by challenging those inherited ideas about what is our culture and what is our teachings, to disrupt some of that limits us right now from having honest, critical conversations with each other. And we have to assume responsibility for our parenting and our teaching and how we model actions, and for the institutional developments that we hope to inform, like attempts to indigenize the university. This work isn't something that we've ever wanted to do alone, and I know Jay said that I'm doing everything, but I don't like doing it by myself. It's not very fun, and it's not easy. And I'm very fortunate to work with those folks on the Aboriginal Advisory Circle, whose leadership and dedication and vision allows for us to work collectively towards creating the place that we want our children to attend and our grandchildren to be a part of. My daughter's a student here. And as a student, she walks our hallways and she sees the spaces where issues need to be addressed, and she hears the conversations that need to be disrupted. And it's not her work alone, and it's not our students' work alone, but it is our collective work. And over the course of the next few years, my hope is that indigenizing efforts here will continue on, and that they'll grow and expand, and that the work will shift beyond simply telling people what we mean by indigenization, and that it'll become more active academic indigenization. And we can't do that alone. So I'm worried, and at this point I feel a little bit better. Actually, I feel a lot better. I was thinking I wouldn't feel better till about 10 o'clock tonight, but I'm amongst friends, right? And we're working together to create the kinds of institutions that we want, and that gives me hope. So thank you for your presence here today, and thank you for the conversations which will follow.